Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to you all over the world. It's great to see you in the chat saying where you're joining us from. And this is truly an international and global audience with us today. We've had, I think, over 500 people registering for this particular webinar today, the latest in our Innovation at Work webinar series from MIT Sloan Executive Education. I'm Peter Hurst. I'm the Senior Associate Dean for Executive Education at the Sloan School, and it's been my pleasure and my privilege for now many years to be one of the hosts of these webinars. And today we're going to do something a little bit different, and I think you're going to find it very interesting and very valuable. What's different is that those of you that have seen this show many times before know that usually what we do is we bring you an audience with one of our teaching faculty from the MIT Sloan School who teach in our executive education programs, and we explore a subject with them. Today, what we're doing, which is a little bit different, is we're going to introduce you to two colleagues of mine at the MIT Sloan School who are not on the teaching faculty, but they are very talented facilitators and in their own right now educators for ourselves internally. And so these are two individuals that have really been significant forces in helping us as an organization ourselves at the MIT Sloan School address our challenges as well as the world challenges around diversity, equity, inclusion, and in particular, how we have really tried to accelerate our journey to being a more open and a more inclusive organization ourselves. So this is a little bit different, but I know that you're going to really get a lot of insights from the next hour or so. This is intended to be interactive as well, so the format as usual, in a few moments, I will introduce and hand over to our two speakers, Benjamin Daniel and Samantha McGurgan. They will talk for a little while about the work that they've been doing, and in particular, this question of how do we create an open and inclusive network. They'll give us some really practical tips. But as that goes along, if you've got any questions, please do put them in the Q&A, and I'll come back in a little while and help make sure that we get through as many questions as possible. If you've got general observations that are not questions, but ideas or thoughts that you'd like to share as the presentations go along, do feel free to do that in the chat as well. Questions in the Q&A, comments in the chat. That helps us make sure that we keep track and get around to as many of your questions as possible. So let's move on to the next slide, please, and let me briefly introduce our two speakers today. First up is Benjamin Daniel. Benjamin is an assistant director in our DEI office at MIT Sloan School, where he is responsible for communications, and he is a very experienced and highly respected communications professional. You can see a slide here a little bit about what some of his background is. And Benjamin is joined today by another colleague, Samantha McGurgan, who is the Associate Director of Career Education in our Career Development Office at the MIT Sloan School, another very experienced and highly respected professional in our community here at MIT Sloan. So I will be handing over to Benjamin and to Sam, and they will take you through a presentation now. I will disappear for a little while, but I'll be watching the questions and we'll come back in about 30 minutes or so and help put those questions to our speakers. But in the meantime, let me invite them both to come onto the virtual stage and begin their presentation of an open, inclusive approach to networks. Benjamin, Samantha, take it away, please.
Thank you so much, Peter, and thank you for another opportunity to co-facilitate with Benjamin Daniel. We love any excuse to get to work together. For those of you who are joining us, we're so happy to have you here. What we have is a mini lesson planned for you today that replicates the content from the Open and Inclusive, or O+I, training that we supported the DEI office in rolling out for the greater Sloan community. A key component of the training is that it challenges participants to take action. So that's what we're here to do today. We'll provide you a little bit of content, but we'll also ask for your participation as we go along. We believe at Sloan that we are smarter together. And we also believe in this session, it'll be better when we are all participating together as well. So now I'll hand it over to Benjamin to kick us off.
Awesome. Next slide, please. Thank you, Sam. Thank you, Peter. Thank you, Julie. Thank you, Elaine. And thank you, Eric, working in the background. Thanks to our captioner, too. Inclusivity isn't just about sort of those surface level things. It's also ensuring that we create the circumstances in which as many people who want to participate can actually participate. So we're going to start with a little bit of an interactive thing. When you were invited to this presentation, you may have received a link to a document where it asks you to list 5 of your go-to people. So we want you to think, when you have advice, when you are looking for advice, when you have a question about something substantial, when you want to buy a TV or you want to figure out where to send your kids to daycare, who are the people to whom you turn most frequently for answers to those kinds of questions? Professional, personal, otherwise, entirely up to you. Write the names of those people on your worksheet or on a piece of paper if you don't have the worksheet. And we're going to return to this a little bit later. Hold on to that sheet. It's going to be important. Next slide, please, Sam.
So what are we going to do today? We have a little bit of content and then we'll open it up for questions afterward. But first, Benjamin and I will provide you an overview of O+I. We'll help you understand how O+I applies to network creation and growth. And then, like we do best, provide you some O+I based tools toward network creation and growth.
Awesome. Next slide, please. Thanks so much. All right. So what is this Open+Inclusive that we're talking about? We're talking about a necessary change in work climate and culture. When we say necessary, we mean that MIT, being the quant-heavy institution that it is, has conducted quite a lot of research on how folks from members of a bunch of different communities find themselves in and among their partners here at MIT and at MIT Sloan. And from 2012 to up to now, what we've seen is some consistency in how folks who hail from marginalized communities view their time and experiences at MIT Sloan versus folks who hail from majority communities. And so when we're talking about a necessary change in work climate and culture, we're asking that we create the circumstances in which all of our colleagues across all of the demographic dimensions with which we're all probably familiar, race, age, gender, culture, socioeconomic status, and the like, feel empowered and encouraged to offer themselves in terms of business outcomes, conversations, and the like when the opportunity arises. So when we're talking about this change, it requires organizational support and it requires behavioral change, not only in the individuals, but on the teams that those individuals comprise, right? But it also asks that we reorient ourselves in terms of how we interact with and value one another. And what we want to do is we want to create an organization that is characterized by what we call conscious inclusion. Or conscious inclusion, what it does is it asks that we actively and consistently acknowledge and explore the differences that we all share, right? A couple of things to note here. Some of us who could mean well, say things or behave in ways that advance ideas like, I don't see color, or I don't see race, or, I'm not racist. Some of my best friends are insert adjective or noun here. But that ignores the real sociological constraints that attend on being members of certain marginalized groups. It can. So to avoid engaging with those differences is akin to continuing to empower those differences, especially when we're talking about folks who hail from disadvantaged communities. Not noticing our differences doesn't recognize the value of diversity. Systemic inequality can oftentimes rest on stereotypical beliefs that advantage some folks and disadvantage others. And neutrality runs the risk of assuming that those default beliefs are true, especially when we're talking about marginalized groups. What we're asking folks to do is to begin to explore some of the ideas underpinning the why, surrounding how and why we do what we do, depending on how people look or the socioeconomic or other demographic backgrounds from which they hail. Next slide.
Thank you. And like many other things, if not all, of content created at Sloan comes from MIT Sloan research. So what you see on this slide here is a few things. The first one is one of the pathways identified in the research is a reason for optimism. Diverse teams contain more divergent information, knowledge, and expertise. That is science. That isn't what we feel. That's what we've seen through extensive research here at Sloan. But with that comes the flip side of it, is a reason for pessimism, is that diverse teams can lack focus, engagement, and an ability to collaborate. So the bottom line here is that diversity has the potential to increase collective learning, but not if we can't manage and embrace our differences. So I'm going to pass it back to Benjamin, and he'll talk more about conscious inclusion and how that works on a team.
Awesome. Thanks, Sam. Next slide, please. So let's talk about conscious inclusion and diverse teams, right? So diversity is, again, something that occurs across a series of demographic identities, right? It talks about background, their experiences, right? And how we solve problems. So here's an opportunity to kind of dig into this a little bit. And I'll ask that you use the chat to do this or otherwise engage with us in the Q&A section. When you get stuck, when you as a business professional or as a business leader get stuck, how do you tend to handle those problems? Do you see the strategy you use for handling challenges identified here on this slide? Do you consider whether or not it's something you've done before? Do you attempt alternative strategies as long as they get you to where you're trying to go? Do you include other people in the decision-making process? Do you brainstorm ideas that are meant to help you uncover alternative ways to look at the challenge and perhaps find a way that might not otherwise have occurred to you to engage with it? Or do you take different solutions that you found and attempt to use them in new and interesting ways? Now, diversity with respect to perspectives and problem solving is necessary, right? It gives you what we call external range, but it's not necessarily sufficient to create internal cohesion among your teams. And in some instances, it can in fact make that cohesion more difficult to happen. Now, if you're interested in taking advantage of diversity, you have to actively notice and explore differences. Again, what we call conscious inclusion. You need to be willing to understand and recognize that different people have different backgrounds, with different business experiences, with different personal, social experiences, might have different perspectives to bring to bear on the challenge that you're trying to solve, and that actively engaging those folks can be of use to you as a business leader, as a professional, as someone interested in solving a challenge. You could potentially have an opportunity to figure out the kinds of problem solvers you have in the room. One of the things we like to say in Open+Inclusive is that the knowledge is in the room, right? So before seeking vendor support, take a look at your team and figure out who in and among those folks might potentially help you sort through what you're dealing with. And I'm also curious to know, again, we invite you to use the chat. Is there a problem-solving style that you don't see here? Do you do something that isn't represented here? Use the chat, let us know. We're curious to get your feedback. So there are a couple of things that we also want to emphasize as we're thinking about conscious inclusion and team diversity. You have to create the organizational structure where things like psychological safety are highlighted. You have to be willing to understand that A single perspective isn't necessarily the best perspective just because it's yours. You have to be willing to accept and give assistance to folks with whom you might not otherwise engage because they could potentially produce a better business or personal outcome. And I know that folks at MIT and MIT Sloan struggle with this. It needs to be okay to be wrong. That can't be a problem. People need to be allowed to fail so that you can find your way through to the best solution to a challenge. Next slide, please.
Thank you. So far, we've been discussing how different features of diversity and conscious inclusion are related to team performance. Teams are a little bit different from networks. Teams are smaller, they have a specific leader, they're accountable for specific and compelling performance purposes. There's a timeline, there's a beginning and an end. And this is where networking comes in. Your network is larger, it's more informal, it's loosely defined group of people with various types of expertise who can weigh in to solve different types of problems. In some situations, a focused network is more flexible and inclusive than a small team. So there are some benefits to using a networking approach alongside the work that you do with teams. As a career advisor for MBAs here at MIT Sloan, I have a hunch about some of these responses, but I'm curious to hear from you. If you were to think for yourself for a moment, in about 3 words, how you would describe your reaction to networking, we would love to see it popped into the chat if you would be willing to do so. Otherwise, just kind of think to yourself what your immediate gut response is to the word networking.
Fun, forced.
Yep.
Professional, good, right. Collaboration and shared interests, skills, depends on the task.
Awkward but fun.
Right. Intimidating, okay. Inauthentic, interesting, okay. Need to move beyond the casual, right.
Intentional, yeah.
Right.
So
Thank
you for all of those. And those are similar to what we heard from participants in Open and Inclusive. So what we want to do now is dive into this and look deeper into networking strategies and how to overcome barriers to highlight some of what we know from research about why people network.
Awesome. Next slide, please. So what's the deal with all this networking talk? Why are we doing it? A person in a disadvantaged position might need access to resources and so might seek engagement with folks from advantaged groups in order to get access to those resources. Or maybe that person has previously attempted to raise an idea or ask a question in a meeting, and for whatever reason, they didn't feel included. They didn't feel that they could ask a question and get serious and sustained engagement because of past experiences, because they're uncertain in a group of folks with whom they don't typically engage. Any of a number of reasons might cause trepidation on behalf of the person who's seeking to gain access to a network. So a lot of times we're asked to do a better job, right? But what's a better job mean? What's better mean? So what we're trying to do is to get a better sense of how to standardize engagement across these demographic and ideological and sociological differences, right? We want to be able to incorporate as many different ideas because, again, to Sam's earlier point, research has shown that we tend to produce better outcomes when there's a lot more diversity within our networks in the room when it comes time to make decisions. So people can network for different reasons, right? Some people network because they want knowledge or they want access to even more of the resources than they already have. And some people network because they are better positioned to take advantage of the differences that can accrue to a group, right? They want to better understand the why of a thing. And so they seek out as many perspectives as possible because again, they're interested in generating better outcomes. They want to ensure that as many people with the expertise they need to make a good research-supported, data-driven decision are in the room when it comes time to have the conversations around those decisions. Now, there's no judgment in either of these, right? You can network for whatever reason you like. It doesn't make you a bad person or a good person. It just means that your perspective and, again, those demographic differences in concert with your social position can influence the why of your networking. Whether you're someone who comes from a disadvantaged background or someone who doesn't, that could potentially influence the why of your networking. So it's also important to recognize that as we're attempting to diversify these networks, the structure needs to exist within the organization for those networks to make sense. So if you work at a place where you typically exclude, say, admin level people from meetings, but those admin level people might have some valuable insights into what you're doing. Maybe they're a member of the audience to whom you're trying to sell, or maybe they're an employee that could do double duty as an ambassador for your organization. It's important to ensure that they feel like they can have those conversations and feel empowered to offer feedback that could potentially, again, produce a better outcome. Next slide, please.
Okay, so we know why it's important. We know the different reasons why people might need a network, whether it's access to resources or more knowledge and information. Now it's time to take some action. So networking strategy number 1, or networking 1.0, as we call it, is the challenge to identify a contact who can help you achieve a goal. There are some challenges we've identified here. I'm sure there are others that could be added to this list as well. How do you discover who can be helpful? How do you know what you can even offer in exchange? You might fear that you run the risk of being viewed as overly strategic. And we'll talk to you in a minute in the next coming slides about how to create a strategy to kind of overcome those challenges. But we just wanted to normalize that if networking seems challenging to you, it is more than likely seeming challenging to other people as well as the people you're reaching out to. But that doesn't mean it's not worth a try, right? So we'll talk about the next networking strategy, and then we'll get on to analyzing and making a plan. Next slide, please.
Thanks, Sam. So what if we reconsidered the why of our networking, right? What if we attempted to approach networking as an opportunity to figure out what you have in common with someone else? What if you took a moment to consider how those differences, in concert with the things you have in common, could produce even better outcomes, can broaden the reach of your network, and potentially expose you to new and interesting ideas or new and interesting solutions to some of the challenges we referenced earlier. So remembering that folks network for different needs, what we want to do is move away from a networking that highlights our differences and instead move toward a kind of networking that highlights what we have in common, right? And we want to think strategically about how those commonalities, in concert with those differences, can produce the kinds of interesting and productive and valuable outcomes that I think all of us, as either business leaders or organizational leaders, or just folks who are looking to gain new perspectives and new knowledge, those are the kinds of things that we're interested in. So it's also important to consider the range and the cohesion of your go-to network, bearing in mind that we want to focus more carefully on building that internal cohesion that can occur when you afford others opportunities to enter into your networks and to share the knowledge and experience and skills and abilities that you've gained. So with that in mind, next slide, please.
Now we're going to ask you to return to your list of go-to contacts from the very beginning and take a moment to consider the following on this slide. Think about the composition of your go-to contacts, the race, gender, expertise, culture, the structure of the network, how many of them know each other, where is your network diverse or where isn't it? How is your network holding you back, or helping you? And what can you do to increase diversity in your go-to network? So we'll just give you a minute to think about that for a second, and then we'll rejoin.
As you're considering your networks too, think about this across all of the demographic identities that you know, and perhaps some that you don't. How familiar are you with folks who might hail from the LGBTQ plus community, for example? Or do you regularly work with folks who might not hear as well as others, or who might have challenges related to sight, or who use a wheelchair, right? So all of those people can offer interesting and valuable perspectives as you consider the structures of your network, its relative diversity, whether or not it's helping you or holding you back, and how, again, to Sam's earlier point, you might increase your network's diversity. All right, bop on over to the next slide. So a couple of interesting things have happened in the business world that lend some credence to the notion of ensuring that a diverse network is sort of de rigueur. A while ago, a brand called H&M, a brand many of us might know, had a campaign and a line of clothing that featured a picture of a monkey on it. It's pretty innocuous, right? Folks like zoos, kids like animals, except the models, the kids that they were using to model the monkey sweatshirts were Black kids. Now, for those who don't know, monkey has for years, both in America and in other countries, been something of a derogatory term for Black folks. And so for many people in those audiences, placing a Black kid inside a monkey sweatshirt was problematic on any of a number of levels. Now, someone in that group who say look like me, or many other of us in this webinar, might have said, hey, this could be a problem. Here's the historical context. Here's the why underpinning why we maybe shouldn't go this way or use a different model. So that is a crisis comms issue that might have been avoided if another person with different experiences was in the room. Another example, really quickly, Balenciaga recently did a campaign that asked folks to look at their brand through a bondage lens. Now, folks have their predilections and peccadillos, right? But a brand like Balenciaga doing something for public consumption where bondage was featured raised quite a few folks' ire. Now, we're not making a moral judgment here. What we're saying is, before making the kinds of decisions that could potentially negatively impact your brand, institution, or organization, it might be great to ensure that there is as diverse a group of individuals in the room who could offer valuable perspective and ideas regarding something like that, so as to potentially avoid the negative consequences that could accrue to you down the line. So when you're thinking about your networks, consider again what's missing, what kinds of perspectives, but also think about your needs as an individual or as a business leader or as someone who's looking to diversify their networks because they're looking to gain access to knowledge that they might not otherwise have. And again, think about this from a lens of inclusion rather than exclusion. What do you have in common with those folks that might gain access to your network, or to whose networks you might now gain access? And how might that benefit you as a leader, or as a business owner, or as a strategist, or as a communicator, or as a person seeking to better understand and engage with people who might not at first blush have anything to offer them because of those demographic lines of difference? So we're going to ask you to take a second or two, right, considering all that we've described, and figure out how you might apply this networking 2.0 mentality, where you look for areas of convergence, where you look for commonalities rather than differences, and where you seek out other perspectives because they could potentially help you become a better business leader, or business owner, or educator, communicator, whatever. Take a second. You either pop it in the chat or just write it down for further consideration in the future. All right, next slide.
Okay, and now here's the part where we ask you to take meaningful action to expand your sounding board. Start by evaluating and adjusting your approach to networking 1.0 and networking 2.0. Assess and examine the personal commitments you've made to improve and or strengthen the diversity of your networks. And we have some powerful readings that we will share with you afterward in a follow-up email about multicultural experience and being an effective leader, and an article about Google and what it learned from its quest to build the perfect team. We did it, Benjamin. Thank you, everyone, for your participation. It was fantastic to have you give us your feedback in the chat as we went through that content. We really appreciate you.
Great. Thank you, Samantha. Thank you, Benjamin, and everyone. That was an invitation to ask more questions in the Q&A if you have any burning questions. And while we're waiting for that, thank you so much for this. You know, I really love this sort of idea of redefining the concept of networking from networking 1.0 to networking 2.0. That itself was very powerful, and one of those things that when you hear, when you see it, it just has a big impact. But I'm curious. I'm imagining we might have many people, and I could see this in some of the questions that were coming in, that would be, you know, thinking about, well, how do I communicate these ideas and share this kind of approach with my colleagues, with my organization. So perhaps you could share with us, Benjamin and Samantha, as you know, you've been through the process of introducing these ideas, this material to us here at the Sloan School and MIT more broadly in some ways. What are some of the things that you've learned from that process that you think could be, you know, valuable to folk who are trying to encourage others to adopt this way of redefining networking and thinking differently about the actions that we can all take?
I'll jump in first, and then Sam, I hope you'll join me. I think that one of the important things, Peter, that we've discovered is that the institutional support for this kind of work has to be present, right? So leadership needs to evince this, not only by saying, hey, folks, go take that cool Open+Inclusive workshop that Sam and Benjamin facilitate, but also by building out the kind of practical infrastructure, be that the way that they handle meetings, handing off meeting facilitation to different folks during meetings, offering folks opportunities during meetings within the leadership team to have conversations about upcoming events and soliciting feedback, or ensuring that folks have an ownership stake in the process by building that sense of engagement and empowerment into the onboarding process. When a person enters your organization, let them know from the beginning, hey, this is how we operate. Now, it can't be theoretical, right? There needs to be the actual means through which to do this work. But if you build that into that infrastructure, if it becomes part and parcel of your day-to-day processes, then you're more likely to see success, and you're more likely to generate the kinds of cool and interesting ideas that are going to lead to better outcomes and potentially increase productivity. And also give your folks an ownership stake in your outcomes and successes.
Yeah, and couldn't have said it better myself, Benjamin. So glad you went first. I have another thought too, and it's that at the very beginning of all this, I think it was 2.5 years ago now, it started as a call from leadership out to the community saying, we're working on this. Who wants in? And we raised our hands and we were a part of it from the very beginning. And our committee was very clear on what the goal was. We're not going to solve racism with open and inclusive training, but what we are going to do is take action with what we can, with the people we have who we are focusing on, the people who are willing to make the change and get started. So I think if there's resistance to thinking the barrier is pretty big, right? If you're going from zero to solving racism, and there's a lot of people who might resist even a action. So my advice would be to focus on your allies, focus on the people who are willing to jump in and raise their hand and get started.
Great, thank you. I think that's all very, very powerful ideas. I'm just looking at some of the questions that have been coming in. One of our regular thoughtful attendees, Cheryl Salazar, has asked a few quite good questions, but let me start with one that has to do with what's the difference between connections and truly a network. She's really sort of interested in exploring how do you go beyond, okay, I've put myself in a place where I might meet or interact with people, but there's something different about actually counting that as my network. And have you got any tips for how to create that kind of stronger interaction that isn't just a long list of people that you've met?
Sam, I'm happy to go first again, but I want to make sure that we don't.
No, go for it. As I'm thinking,
okay, cool.
I'm putting my thoughts together. Go for it. Thanks.
Okay, cool. So that's a great question. So I'm going to draw a rough analogy here, and I'm going to fumble it a little bit, but I hope that when we get to the end, you'll understand what I'm saying. Imagine, if you will, that someone's moving into a new neighborhood, right? Well, you want to understand how things function in the neighborhood. Where are the best places to go? Where are the best places to eat, right? Now, if you've never been there before, you're likely to reach out to people who live there. It could be your realtor. It could be the person that recommended that you live there, right? The difference between those surface level connections and the kinds of deep and consistent connections that differentiate networks from sort of those surface level things is the person who invited you in, the person who invited you to the neighborhood actually has you at their house. You visit. There are pictures of you on the phone with that person, not just at a wedding with a bunch of other people, but consistently over the course of however long it takes for you to get moved in. The person who's interested in that surface level connection is going to say, hey, see that Black guy all the way in the back in my wedding picture? Man, see, some of my best friends are Black, right? So that's the kind of surface level stuff we want to avoid. We want to ensure in order to ensure that level of engagement is important and valuable, you want to get past that initial conversation by asking your leadership, or if you're in leadership, inviting the kinds of engagement that are going to allow for those kinds of connections. And again, you have to build it into your processes. If you've got a workflow that excludes a bunch of different people because it's the way you've always done things, then you're likely to produce the same kinds of outcomes, right? But if you've got a workflow where more than the team lead and the content strategist and the subject matter expert are involved, if you invite other people in, potential audiences and the like, to that iterative process, you're more likely to produce better outcomes, and you're more likely to get folks who are going to want to engage as a matter of course, rather than because you took a workshop and went back to the office and decided to engage with person X.
Yeah, and thanks for that, Benjamin. And I think to dovetail off that, I think contacts are in your network. Loose ties are a really important component of a network. But when you go to make an important decision, who are you reaching out to? Probably not your loose ties, probably your sounding board, probably the people that are a little more close to you. So that's where that exercise of really examining what your sounding board looks like, because the more diverse the perspectives are of the folks on that sounding board, the better your decisions will be.
You have to actively work to convert those loose ties to something like what Sam just described. And that active engagement can be scary, right? It asks you to talk to people with whom you might not otherwise speak. It asks you to put yourself out there in a way that could prove uncomfortable for you. But imagine that the person with whom you're attempting to engage is also feeling the same thing. So again, thinking about areas of convergence, you could start with something as simple as, hey, we both work at the same place, right? So already you've got something in common that you might not otherwise have in common. So there's an opportunity for you to explore strengthening a tie that already exists for reasons that could potentially yield better, more inclusive, more productive business outcomes.
Great, that's helpful. Thank you. Now I'm going to try to put together some questions that a few people asked and morph them into one question. This is based. Thank you for the questions, Rachel and also Cheryl and Victoria. So on the one hand, folks like yourselves and other people who are now sort of professionals and in the DEI space are perhaps in a lot of demand as nodes in these networks that we're suggesting everybody builds, because first of all, you're putting yourself out there, and so you're very visible in that way. But Rachel's very concerned about what the bandwidth of colleagues who are identified in as being kind of the professionals or the experts in issues around diversity and inclusivity and equity in an organization might be, and how to deal with that. But I think there's a related question, which I know that we've thought a lot about as well, which is there also a risk that certain people, because they're seen as representing particular demographics, get overly sought out as being sort of members of networks for people that are looking for those perspectives, particularly in organizations that aren't that diverse to start with. And you're wondering what your experience of either of those questions might be, and just sort of Victoria's take on that as well is, given all of that, perhaps how do we make sure that that this is really not just performative, and that actually there is both authenticity and real outcome from the strategies that we use. Maybe I should steer that to you, Samantha, first, as Benjamin has been answering first so many times.
Sure. So my first reaction is probably a few questions. It sounds like the question is, how do we reduce tokenism of having, say, one person on the team being the representative for that entire identity? And another question is how to protect the people who are doing the DEI work. And I don't know if I have all the answers, but something that does help is there's a lot of free DEI work that is happening right now that is burdening, perhaps burdening isn't the right word, but that falls on the shoulders of people of color, people of marginalized identities. So one solution might be to pay people for this otherwise unpaid work that they are doing so, and giving them a chance to opt in. Burden is accurate. Thank you for that. So that's an idea. And then also, the more normalized open and inclusive is in the culture, my hunch is that also reduces the burden again on the populations that are most affected. And our goal in this particular training is to start with a baseline of all of the staff. All staff are required to take it, and just to kind of create a toolkit and a common lexicon in our community about how we treat people, and just sort of starting there. But I don't know if that's an exact prescription that gives an exact response or answer to that. And I'm curious, Benjamin, what your thoughts are on that too.
So Sam, I think that one of the things we've learned is that this stuff is so intricate and nuanced that the notion of a single source of truth or a single answer is already misguided, right? I think that if you know or are interested in your history, and Victoria, I'm going to get to your question about performative allyship in just a second, I promise. If you know your history, you know that any civil rights movement in any place, anywhere, has inevitably involved a cross-section of individuals interested in advancing social justice, not only for the marginalized, but for those people who live alongside and work alongside those members of those marginalized groups. So the difference, to Victoria's point, between performative allyship, right, and allyship that is meant to have an end goal in mind is that level of engagement. One of the things we talk about in Open+Inclusive, and this is MIT, it's MIT Sloan, you've got rooms full of quants, right? What's an effective Open+Inclusive? How does that look in practice, right? So one of the things we're doing is we're surveying Open+Inclusive participants before they enter and after they enter, right? So that we can see if we're inculcating any of the lessons we're attempting to get them to understand, and if they're following through by understanding and retaining that knowledge. Now, that's the think piece. What we next need to understand and what we're trying to do is to build out how to measure whether or not behavioral change is occurring. So we've got some really smart data analysts and systems design folks who are developing something that's meant to help us to better understand how that's working. Bringing it back to performative allyship, Open+Inclusive, and diverse networks, those folks who are interested and invested in the work, like a Sam McGurgan, like Benjamin, are going to raise their hands to Sam's earlier point and say, hey, I want to be involved, right? But also, because this is an organizational effort, leadership that's invested in the work is going to say, hey, how do we do this? I have some blind spots. Can you help me to understand those blind spots and to potentially ameliorate some of those biases that I've learned over the course of a life spent not having to really engage with any of this stuff? So the performative allies, they kind of tell on themselves. And the folks who are serious about the work tend to just kind of get in there and do the job without sort of looking for acknowledgement or pats on the back.
Great, that's helpful. And just paraphrasing some other questions that I've seen coming through here, going back to the, you had such an emphasis on action, both of you, which is very powerful. Have you got any suggestions for where and how people can try to find different connections and build these networks, whether it's professionally at work or outside work, and especially what's your suggestions, or what have you found that works on actually engaging people in some kind of interaction that leads to creating the sort of relationships that you're advocating for here?
Sam, you go first again.
So if I understand the question correctly, it's how do you even go about moving your network forward? Where can you be involved? And I think it depends on the person, but it might be a volunteer opportunity. One way to get really active into this work is to, instead of stepping outside the community looking in, get involved with the community itself and be around people who may be different from yourself, but also different from each other. That for some of our participants, it might look like sports. It might look like a volunteer assignment at work. It might look like being in their community at their children's schools. Something for me personally, I like to have a job that connects me with someone else, whether it's paid or not, and having that sort of shared goal together, whether it's a volunteer opportunity in the community at Sloan or in my community here in the greater Boston area. It's a great sort of excuse to get to know people, and just sort of being in the same proximity as people generally increases your ability to connect with them. So getting outside of your comfort zone and being creative about what that looks like could be really important. And we've had participants in our sessions who, when we learn more about them in our uncovering the knowledge in the room activities, were incredible humans who had amazing hobbies and interests and skills. And if that hadn't been surfaced, we wouldn't have known. So something simple could even just be like asking someone about themselves. It's kind of simple, but it's really powerful. And Benjamin, I see you nodding, so I'm curious to hear your thoughts too.
No, I think one of the cool things we do, Peter, to your earlier point, and Sam, you know this as a facilitator, is we start at the beginning by encouraging engagement, by asking a real world, real life question of our participants. If you have a need, do you need groceries delivered? Do you need help finding childcare? Do you need to find out where a cool, I don't know, conference or Comic-Con is happening? Ask the room. And it really forces people to think carefully about some of the reasons why they don't engage. But also, it takes a practical challenge and asks the group to come up with a practical solution. And that's kind of what this is all about, right? Is figuring out those areas where you don't necessarily have all the answers. I think that oftentimes folks are asked to know everything, which is not possible, or to know as much of a thing as can be known, which again is not possible, rather than seeking assistance. And so we force engagement. And I think institutionally, organizationally, you have to force engagement. And that engagement needs to come from both the bottom up and from the top down. And I can't stress this enough. The cultural piece is incredibly important. Oftentimes we tend to complicate these things, but Sam mentioned earlier, you just got to show up, say, hey, I want to be counted. And that showing up in terms of creating these open+inclusive networks could be as simple as sitting with someone at lunch with whom you don't typically sit, or asking a question of a person in a meeting who doesn't typically speak up, right? But that first step forward needs to be taken. And what we found and what research has consistently shown is that the rest tends to take care of itself, with the caveat that, again, you need to build that stuff into your normal operating procedures, right? It's not something that is going to bubble up organically, but the building can occur with the assistance of your colleagues, other faculty, other staff, whomever. And if you commit to it consistently, it becomes par for the course rather than something that happens sort of over there sometimes.
Great, thank you. Well, those two answers and actually, the whole presentation and discussion completely exemplify. You made the point, both of you, that the role of leaders and leadership is important, but I also suggest, as you did, that leadership throughout an organization and throughout communities is important. It's not just about positional leaders, and both of you have been just tremendous leaders within the MIT Sloan School and within MIT more broadly, and we can't thank you enough for your proactivity and your leadership and the wisdom that you've shared with us today, as well as the very practical ideas and advice. That is what we're all about ultimately, is is not only studying things for the sake of studying them, but actually making a difference, having an impact in the world. And by what you do every day and what you've done in the Open and Inclusive program to yourselves and the broader team that have created that and continue to deliver it, we really appreciate it. We really appreciate you spending the time with us today, sharing this experience. And on behalf of all of the people that joined us and the many people who will be watching the recording of this session later as well, thank you so much to both Samantha and to Benjamin for taking this time with us. It's been inspiring. And with that, I think it's more or less time to share with you, while all of you watching, unfortunately, won't have access to the Open and Inclusive course that you've been hearing about our internal training. We do have still many core programs in executive education that may be relevant and helpful as you think about these issues. One upcoming later this year is a repeat of our Leading a Diverse Workforce program, which really does feature a lot of the research that you've heard about in today's presentation as well. And I see we're very up to date and have a code that you can scan on the screen if you're looking at this visually to be able to see more information about this upcoming program. We also have another Innovation at Work webinar coming up. I think the details on the next slide, February the 1st. I'll be joined by colleague John Davis talking about some of the challenges around family businesses and enterprises. And I'm sure today's topic is among the kinds of challenges that family enterprises and businesses are facing as well. And so hopefully I'll see some of you again on February the 1st. But in the meantime, thank you again, everyone, for joining us and for your excellent questions.